Howdy. And good evening. My name is Dr. Dorsey. I'm the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Student Education and Success in the College of Liberal Arts, as well as the college's Climate and Inclusion Officer. It's my pleasure, on behalf of Dean Oberhelman, who is away at a conference right now, and the College of Liberal Arts, to welcome you to the Second Wave Revolutionary Women of Color Conference, and to this prestigious event this evening, the Pioneers Panel. The panel will be introduced shortly. The college is honored to act as one of the co-sponsors of this conference. I would also like to thank the individual programs that co-sponsored this event as well. They include the Africana Studies Program, the Carlos Cantu Endowment, the Glasscock Center for Research in the Humanities, the Glasscock Chair in History, the Department of History, the Department of International Studies, the Department of Sociology, the Latino, Latina, and Mexican American Studies Program, the Office of Graduate and Professional Studies, the Race and Ethnic Studies Institute, and last but not least, the Women and Gender Studies Program. I'm sure we might all agree that this conference is particularly critical at this juncture in American history. With misguided and pernicious attacks on virtually anything related to race and women's rights, this conference represents a special moment, as it serves as a reminder about the important role that the women being honored here tonight on stage have played in securing those rights. We celebrate their inspiration, and we are guided by the light that they cast. Let me now introduce Dr. Elizabeth Cobbs, the Melbern G. Glasscock Professor of History, whose research on a forthcoming book about the history of women's rights in America served as the spark for this conference. Dr. Cobbs is a preeminent author of 5 history books, including The Hello Girls, America's First Women Soldier from Harvard Press, and 3 historical novels, including most recently, The Tubman Command, about Harriet Tubman's military service in the Civil War. And if that wasn't impressive enough, she is also a documentary filmmaker and has produced 2 films for National Public Television with the support of Texas A&M University. Dr. Cobbs will now introduce the panel members tonight and moderate the panel. Again, welcome from the College of Liberal Arts. I now turn this over to you, Dr. Cobbs.
Well, welcome to all of you, and thank you for your patience. Your patience will be rewarded. This is a very special evening, and I really want to thank Dean Dorsey for kicking off this conference, which actually continues tomorrow if you're interested. But this is our signature event. I hope you enjoyed the brief slideshow that you saw going as you were getting yourself situated. There was one picture in there that actually didn't belong in the lineup. And it was preceded by an article, a newspaper article on one of our panelists, Yvonne Swan. And right after that, there was a picture of a young white woman at a podium. And that was me 45 years ago, when I was about 20. And I organized the last conference I organized, which was also on feminism. And that was the newspaper I was an editor of. So my colleagues will attest, I'm notorious for not really liking administrative work. So it takes something pretty special for me to decide, okay, I'll do that. And what that spark was that I have been writing a book on history of women's rights from Abigail Adams to Beyonce, which I think is like to infinity and beyond, sort of. But and in the course of that, last summer, I met a woman I had followed, whose case I followed 40 more years ago, who was previously known as Yvonne Wanrow. And when I met her, soon after that, I met Martha Cotera, whom I had not known about, and became very excited to know. And I also reread an article I had read, dare I say, 50 years ago, and Sisterhood is Powerful, which was one of the slides you also saw, and that was an article by Frances Beal. So meeting those women made me realize that it was just too important and too rare an opportunity to pass up, to invite my fellow Aggies, as it were, and others from other universities, and we've had people here from Baylor and University of Houston and Rice University and UTSA, and so we're very grateful to have you all here. So what essentially today is about, and I'd like to introduce the individuals But I'd like to say something about the purpose of this conference in a way, which is that there has been long a sort of, I think, misperception that was initially put forward by the media, right, journalists, unintentionally perhaps, at the start of what was called the second wave of then was called the women's liberation movement. The word feminist wasn't used very often at that time. And this misperception was carried forward by scholars, which was that it was essentially a white middle-class women's movement. Certainly there were white middle-class women in it. I was in it. But that perception, it did a grave injustice to what was the actual, just easily documented truth, which often happens in history. There are things that are easily documented that we know that somehow don't ever make it into the books. And this is one of those. And it does a grave injustice to those women who were there, who are still there, doing the hard work of organizing to create a groundswell of support for changes in the law and in custom that allow women to have the full dignity. And of course, it's an ever receding goal, but it's a goal we've come closer to again and again as a country, or we wouldn't be sitting here today. So it does a grave injustice to the work that they did, the sacrifices that they made. The other problem with that misperception is it creates kind of this weird, like, criticism that also shadows, in a way, the movement. And one of those is that by saying it was a white women's movement, it makes it feel like for women who aren't white, there was this sort of an implication that, well, if you are defending your rights, then maybe you're doing this white kind of thing, which is a negative, it can be interpreted that way. And that was hard sometimes for women of color, and my guests will speak to it much better than I can. The other issue is that it also perpetuated the impression that white feminists were maybe perhaps intentionally excluding women of color from the feminist movement. Now, the movement, which included feminism and many other things, was something so porous that it would be impossible to exclude anyone who wanted to be a part of it. And yet, I think that was part of also this. So that's going to be all blasted because that idea will obviously be shown to be incorrect today. So to let me introduce my particular people we've got here today, I'd like to say, and first off, that I regret to announce that one of our keynote speakers, Frances Beal, suffered a fall earlier this week. She's okay, but she's in the hospital. And we have in her stead the wonderful Professor Ula Taylor on my far left. Professor Taylor is a well-renowned historian who has written numerous books on such things as The Promise of Patriarchy, Women in the Nation of Islam, a fascinating and controversial book, a pictorial history of the Black Panther Party, a biography of Amy Garvey, who was the wife of Marcus Garvey. So she covers the whole 20th century. And she's now writing a biography with Frances Beal. And Frances had prepared comments that she asked Ula to come and give to you. So Ula will be doing that in a moment. We also have in the middle here, Martha Cotera, my new friend, who, the resume goes one down my arm and down the up. Most notably, most famously, she was a founder of the Raza Unida Party in 1971, and she arrived at the organizing conference 9 months pregnant, undeterred, so that she could help form the Women's Caucus, as she did with others, and herself ran for the school board of Texas. And she wanted to make sure that Chicanas were not just in the House, but also in the Senate, and has been working on that ever since. She's also the author of the Chicana Feminist and Diosa Yembra, which you saw pictured here above. And lastly is my friend Yvonne Swan, whose story brought me to this auditorium. Do that thumbnail sketch, and she will tell us more about it. But Yvonne was a young mother of 2 children in the early 1970s. And in 1973, she was convicted for the shooting death of a man. That man, the day before, had tried to assault her young son. He had been arrested twice before for sexual assault of a minor, never convicted. He had also been testified against him that he had raped a young girl. All of this he knew when he called the police, and the police told them he would have to wait until Monday, because there was no authorization for doing anything more until she filed the formal complaint. And so when at dawn the next day, that same man entered the house, her sister and 8 children, mostly under the age of 7. And he went towards the young boy. And then when they yelled at him to get out, and he turned around and came at Yvonne close enough to put his hands to his neck and her neck. And he was 6'2", 180 pounds. And she was 5'4" and 120 pounds, and had her leg in a cast. And she very pulled it out that she had brought, because blank, that it left a mark. This man could have killed her, and instead, tragically for her, tragically for him, instead. And they charged her, and the court sentenced her for 20 to 20 years in prison, indoor, in a house, defending her children. And they said, the court did, that was because a reasonable man confronted with another man would have simply raised his fist. So feminist attorneys working with William Kunstler from the Center for Constitutional Law, some of you may know about him defending the Chicago 7 and other groups. He recommended, he thought there might be some feminist, perhaps women's issues, but Yvonne will tell you about this. And ultimately she was exonerated by those 2 feminist attorneys working on order tonight. And I'd like to turn it over now to Ula Taylor. You may go there, you can sit here and walk around, go into the audience, but go up to the podium if you like. Absolutely. Yes, and when, Professor Taylor is going to run a video, and she will wave to the wonderful people in the booth when you're ready, and we'll do that whenever you go on your cue.
Good evening, good early evening. How are you doing? You doing all right? Good. I am glad to be here. And I am sad to be here without my very good friend, Fran Beal. But Fran Beal, as has already been shared with you, is unable to be with us because she recently had a fall and she's in a rehabilitation hospital. Because she was so excited about this opportunity to be with you, she had already drafted comments for this special occasion. And present them to you with the message on my part in terms of firmly contextualizing. Ignited by the question of how she became a feminist, Fran scored. On one hand, it was the urgency of the political moment, and on the other, it was the personal impact of almost dying from an abortion and knowing someone who had actually died from an abortion. Combined, the political atmosphere with the personal trauma informed why she became a Black feminist. She entered the political landscape of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, commonly known as SNCC, after living 6 years in Paris, France, from 1960 to 1966. She had gone to Paris as a student, a junior from the University of Madison, Wisconsin, and she was also a newlywed. When she arrived in New York, when she returned, to New York City from Paris in 1966, she had 2 diplomas, 2 children, a rocky marriage, and radical thoughts about domestic and international politics. By 1960, with the help of her mother and brother, she really embraced political self. And Lisa were 6 and 5 years old when she navigated single motherhood and political activism. Prior to becoming a mother, Fran had had 2 abortions, one in New York City and one in Paris. Both were illegal and both almost killed her. These experiences and that of her friend Cassandra, who had died from a botched abortion, placed the importance of having safe options at the forefront of her thinking. It took courage for a Black woman to talk about safe abortions when Black nationalists, particularly from the Nation of Islam, spoke about them as a form of genocide. It took courage to make distinctions between the choice of having a safe abortion and the forced sterilization of Indigenous women, African American women, and Puerto Rican women. It took courage to talk about safe abortions when the 1965 Moynihan Report described Black women as matriarchs in need of paternalistic control. It was a brave declaration at the time. Fran knew the importance of having the choice, and she explains it in her own words. I would now like to show you a 5-minute film clip from She's Beautiful When She's Angry, a 2014 film by Mary Dorr, which chronicles the events and people of the feminist movement from 1966 to 1971. The film includes interviews with both Linda Burnham and Frances Beal, and it serves to give you a snapshot into her activism around the need for safe abortions. So we're ready for the clip. Black women are being asked about okay. Thank you. I have to say that Linda Burnham, who you first saw in the video, continues to be a sister friend to Frances Beal. In fact, that's why Fran moved to Oakland, California, because Linda was there. So I think it's important to talk about how these organizations created a certain kind of sisterly connection that didn't evaporate after the organized quote, quote, movement, so to speak. So Fran advocated for safe abortions. And as an active member of SNCC, she participated in a lot of their New York City projects. One project that she was deeply committed to was SNCC's project against the Vietnam War. Fran was outraged by the draft that fed the Vietnam War. It affected her personally because she had 3 brothers. Early on in the United States, it was considered ultra-left to support the anti-war activities, recalled Fran. SNCC didn't take a public anti-war stand until after the January 3rd, 1966 murder of Sammy Young, who was a SNCC worker, a student at Tuskegee University, and a Navy veteran. He was shot in the face by a white gas station attendant because he had the courage to use a white-only bathroom at a gas station in Tuskegee, Alabama. 3 days after, SNCC became the first civil rights group in the United States to formally oppose the Vietnam War. Yet conversations against the Vietnam War had begun as early as the summer of 1964 in SNCC. Fran remembered these discussions and how they were cultivated by consciousness-raising dialogue. By 1968, in addition to anti-Vietnam, there were intense conversations about working with white radicals and class analysis of the freedom struggle. In New York, Fran recalled that white radicals were important to SNCC activists, as well as centering class in the conversations. By comparison, Stokely Carmichael and Kwame Ture, who later becomes Kwame Ture, and other SNCC members in Atlanta, Georgia, were being pulled toward Black nationalism and questioned Black and white coalitions and Marxian ideas of class conflict. These ideological differences magnified tensions on the future direction of SNCC. Yet these were not the only elephants in the room, so to speak. The Oakland, California Black Panther Party for Self-Defense by 1968 had gained traction in the freedom movement. As SNCC was trying to figure out what kind of relationship it would have with the Black Panther Party, Eldridge Cleaver's book, 1968, Soul on Ice, was published. James Forman encouraged SNCC members in New York City to read it. Given that Cleaver's book is filled with misogynistic violence, Fran Beal and other SNCC women, Gwen Patton and Mae Jackson, who read the book together, were disgusted. They were very concerned about uniting with the Panthers because of the sexism. The book was evidence to them that they really needed a women's group within SNCC to promote equality. At a December 1968 meeting with a majority male audience, the book was discussed. Fran Beal and others made presentations and argued the role of women in the Black freedom struggle should be an equal one. Some of the newer male members of SNCC were supportive of Cleaver's text. This outraged Fran and the other women in attendance. How could SNCC endorse a book that describes raping Black women? They pointed out sections of the book where Cleaver's remarks were detrimental to the empowerment for all people. At the end of the discussion, Forman put the Black Women's Liberation Committee on the election floor as a new SNCC project. Fran Beal, Gwen Patton, and Mae Jackson formed the Black Women's Liberation Committee because of the growing sexism in SNCC and the Black freedom movement in general. The Black Women's Liberation Committee transformed into the Third World Women's Alliance around 1970, 1971. Now, most historians of SNCC describe its political end by 1968, but this is when we see Fran Beal's activism. As historian Clay Carson writes, quote, "The only SNCC project during the early 1970s that gave any evidence of success was a feminist group called the Third World Women's Alliance, headed by Frances Beal. Even the steady growth of the alliance did not stem SNCC's decline, however, since Beal obtained independent means of financial support for the group and operated autonomously," end of quote. The brilliant historian Robin Spencer, who you can hear tomorrow, has asked, why do we name a decline in a movement when women's concerns and issues move to the center? 1968 is a watershed moment when it comes to the United States civil rights history, the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the escalation of the war in Vietnam, forever marked an end of an era. Yes, yet Fran Beal and her activist peers became even more committed to the fight at this very moment. Thus, one of the benefits of analyzing Frances Beal in 1968 and beyond is to see how Black radicals maintained their position, their political dedication outside of cultural nationalist groups like the Nation of Islam, and kept gender equality and the class struggle and international affairs at the vortex of their freedom dreams. Women in the Black Women's Liberation Committee took consciousness-raising sessions to another level. In fact, Frances Beal 1968 essay, Black Women's Manifesto, Double Jeopardy, to be Black and female, developed from the Black Women's Liberation Committee conversations. Fran is always careful with me to say that although her name is on the essay, it came out of collective struggle and conversations. While passionate prose grounded in verifiable evidence and robust theory will become Frances Beal's political intervention and lasting contribution, so to speak, being a mother shaped what she said, how deeply committed she was to transformative change. In the midst of daily mothering and working as a secretary in New York City, Frances Beal nurtured her global understanding of the world and commitment to feminist projects. The first sentence in this essay, quote, "In attempting to analyze the situation of the Black woman in America, one crashes abruptly into a solid wall of grave misconceptions, outright distortions of fact, and defensive attitudes on the part of many," end of quote. She then details the way Black women experience the world as Black women. In fact, before there was Kim Crenshaw's use of the term intersectionality, there was Frances Beal's double jeopardy. It's in double jeopardy that intersection goes beyond race, class, and gender to include the international. As Fran has shared with me on numerous occasions, everyone had to decide about their position on Vietnam. And so one could not ignore the international landscape. Frances Beal's feminism formed out of this. She was a single mother who had the audacity to center political work in her daily life. She did this because she understood the fight was for her children's future. Her choices reflected this thinking, and as a Black feminist who has benefited so much from her tenacity to fight and to write, I am deeply, deeply thankful for her. Thank you.
Oh, my goodness. Hi, I want somebody else to do my, okay, somebody step up. You did such a beautiful job. So beautiful, thank you. I wanna thank Lisa and all the wonderful departments, institutes, and programs that she coordinated to help us, you know, to do this wonderful event. And also, of course, Catherine, thank you so much for your work, Catherine Clinton, Dr. Clinton in San Antonio as well. I would like to also thank my husband for being here. My husband of almost 60 years, who knew? He's here and a proud member. Actually, he's a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. A tiny minority of architects get that signal honor because he's an excellent architect. My daughter, Professor Martha Cotera, is also here, will be on the program tomorrow, digital humanities scholar and professor of Latina studies at the University of Texas. So I'm very, the stakes are very high for me today. I want somebody else to do my life. I love that. I love what you did. I'm very disappointed not to meet Fran in person. I've been a fan for a long, long, long time. You know, being aware of her struggles, which were so similar to our own. So I'm very disappointed. Ula did a beautiful job. Thank you so much for bringing her to us. Our job was to actually talk about aha moments in our development as feminists. And I've always said I've been a feminist all my life. I can't remember a time when I wasn't a feminist. And then I realized that, you know, I think for most little girls, the aha moments are actually pretty much when you're born, or I used to say when you look at your booties and you got pink ones. But I now, you know, I think, well, it's when most girls, I think for most girls, it's when you start becoming aware of the gender differences and the privileges that you get depending on your differences. So I started to look at the differences when I was about 4 or 5. I was an avid reader even at 4. I was only allowed to read the Bible, mind you. And so I had a good textbook to go by with regards to women, you know, leaders, women warriors, etc. But I also looked at the differences between the ways that my own, you know, 7 uncles were treated and my 6 aunts were treated, and the ways in which the little boys I grew up with were treated and the way I was treated. And I noticed, and of course, noticing the freedom that they had and the privileges that they had, I wanted to be a boy. I don't know how many, I don't want to ask for hands, but I know that when we look at that, a lot of little girls say, hey, I could do that. You know, but then when thinking about the fact that with the little boys I ran around with, the privileges that they got kind of made them lazy and not too smart because they didn't want to read. They weren't required to do any work. In fact, my grandfather was a leader, Protestant leader in 6 states, 3 in Mexico, 3 in the US. And I noticed that all the girls were assigned texts to say in church from a very little young age, but the boys were not required to do that because they refused to learn the text. So I thought, well, you know, these boys are empowered somehow and privileged somehow. And so I thought, well, maybe it's because of physicality, their physical attributes, their physical skills. And I thought, well, I can do everything else that they can't do, but maybe girls can't do the physical things. So I started experimenting with doing the physical things. And I realized that with a lot of risk, a lot of courage, and having good health, I could do everything that little boys could do. I mean, my mother, if she were alive, she would tell you that I could climb the highest telephone post higher than any boy on my block. I could outskate any boy. I could do marbles. I had the best marbles in the block because I could win them. I could do the tops. You know, you have to do the tops, and I could do that. In Mexico, my grandparents, my hometown, you know, I could ride horses as fast as any boys and got dropped many times too. And I could catch spiders and everything else that they could catch. So I felt, okay, well, if I can do this and then I can also do that, you know, what's the difference? You know, why am I not privileged? And why am I not expected to grow up and be, you know, a leader or a politician or whatever? So then you know, this is, I think, how little girls learn that there is something at play there, that there is a framework, that there is an institutional process that puts you in one camp and not in the other. At the same time, I also noticed that what the women could do that was amazing. My grandmother managed 2 ranches. She managed a business. She managed a total staff of 26 with 14 children and everybody that came along to help with all these children, you know, and yet she was still only a woman. You know, that women did all this important work like sewing, cooking, health care, definitely healthcare, and work, and there were still only women, and that just didn't compute. I also noticed that little boys were expected to be the war makers, to be the ones that defended the community and the nation. And having grown up recently, actually in recent proximity to the Mexican Revolution, I also knew that women had been involved in battles because they came through our town as soldaderas, and the soldaderas were not just the cooks, they were also the fighters. They were expected to fight when it came to that. And yet I noticed that a lot of that, the expectation wasn't that women would go to battle to defend their nation, but that the boys were definitely, women were the exception, but the boys were expected to. And I saw some boys that there's no way I felt that the little boys I knew would actually make it, you know? And so I thought, well, that's not fair. You know, if we're going to have militarized nations and communities, then everybody should be, you know, involved in defending the community and defending the nation. And I knew that in reality, in the communities in Mexico, the women, as in Ukraine today, had to pick up arms and had to defend the nation, you know, and their communities. And so I thought that that was definitely unfair. I also saw a lot of things that of course, later on made a lot of sense to me. My grandmother was a healer. Like a lot of the women had that skill in our community. And we had a birthing room in the big house that they had. And that birthing room was sanitized and ready for anybody. Mind you, this is in the 40s. And sanitized and ready for everybody that needed to have that care. And also, the birthing room was also available for abortions, for people that had midwives that had performed abortions, you know, because then the woman was allowed to recuperate the 40 days that women with normal childbirth were allowed to and expected to recuperate. And they were given the pigeon soup that my grandmother had a palomar, you know, pigeon coops, and provided this. And so it was very natural for us as children of both sexes to see that. So basically, you know, another thing I looked at besides the war making, you know, powers that men were supposed to perform, I also noticed that the standards were very high for men to be the sole providers for their families, regardless of the fact that in real life, this didn't happen, including my grandfather was always out gallivanting, preaching all over the place. But my grandmother was the one that had a staff of 26 people she was responsible for. So that also made me feel like, wait a minute, you know, I saw these men that weren't capable of doing this because they couldn't earn enough, or their health wasn't good enough to work what they had to work to earn to you know, support large families. And then they became, and then sometimes like father, they just went away, you know, like in our case. And so they went away. And the women left ability without any preparation to do that. And so I felt like it wasn't fair that men were the ones that were expected to do that, and that in reality that wasn't happening anyway. So I always said I've got to be self-supporting, no matter what. You know, I have to be like my grandmother, because I really honestly saw as a child, and this is really sad, that if anything happened to my grandfather, you know, my grandmother was already doing everything anyway, you know, but she was doing that because she was capable of doing that. And so it was important to be capable of doing that. It was important to prepare yourself and get an education. And as a child, you know, children see and understand and have these aha moments long before we realize that they're seeing and understanding and having these moments. And to me, you know, this is what made me a feminist. I mean, this whole experience of looking at everything and seeing that gender roles were attributed, you know, indiscriminately, of whether you could actually as a woman produce children or not, or want to produce children or not, or as a man that you could actually want to go to battle or not, you know, that these roles and assumptions made about gender were all attributed, you know, and that they were not biological. And that was an important message, because to me as a young child, that told me that there were choices to be made, you know, that you could choose to assume that role or not. Because I saw men fail at the things that they were expected to do, but then I also saw women fail at the things that were expected to do. And some women were cast aside because they were unable to have children through no fault of their own. And some women, you know, walked out on their families like the men did because they were unable or did not want to assume that role. And to me, I mean, my mother's best friend in El Paso, when she was working at a restaurant, she lied and said she could cook and got a job when she became widowed in El Paso and was single income earner. Anyway, her best friend was a man who was raising 5 children alone because his wife simply didn't want to or couldn't cope and just walked out on them. And so I saw plenty of that, you know, on both sides. And so it was very hard for me to say, well, you know, it has to be this, that, or the other. I just felt like people had to be free to be able to do whatever they needed to do, you know, when they needed to do it up to the capacity and training and education and support that they had to do these things. And I think that basically that was my longest and my best aha moments. And when I look at what I support and have supported all my life as a feminist, you know, it all comes together, because when you look at ERA and why people like Phyllis Chapley, you know, were fighting ERA, it was all about, well, you know, women can't go to battle. And I thought, why the hell not? I mean, if women, even when they want to or not, are paying taxes to a militarized society, then why, you know, did they not have the responsibility to defend the nation like everybody else? You know, why should just be men? And so for feminists that were, I was very lucky to have had these growing up experiences, but for feminists that are real human beings, you know, that makes sense. You're going to support a militarized state, by golly, you got to support it 100%, and you can't back out on your obligation, you know, period. You know, and so the ERA was a no-brainer, you know, for a lot of women like me. In my particular community, the Chicana community, and Chicana movement, we had a long history of resistance by both men and women, militarized resistance against the conquest, you know, that we offered, and including in the US. After 1848, women were up in arms in the US. And so I mean, this is basically, you know, my longest aha moment as a feminist. So when I look at what I support, and I support choice for women, and that's because I saw women exercising choice in my early, what was considered very conservative, traditional childhood. When I see women supporting transgender issues, I revert to my indigenous, you know, upbringing, being in a mestizo in a mestizo family that had strong, in fact, we were raised next to the indigenous mounds of Casas Grandes, born and raised there. You know, we had the indigenous tradition of female goddess worship through the Vírgenes and the Santas, you know, that abounded in our churches and in the Bible even. You know, we had the indigenous tradition of gender fluidity. You know, if I tell you that on Sunday afternoons, my grandmother, Protestant, well, political convert because of the Mexican Revolution and acting against the church, but still a Catholic, Protestant, traditional lady would send us off to a cotillion and tea party that was hosted by a man who worked in construction with my family and in trucking, and on Sundays were dressed in his finest gowns and teach us how to dance and how to behave like proper young men and women. And then after that, we could go to the movies. And my grandmother, after church in the morning, dinner, and then she would say, now don't forget to go to Fidencios for your training. And we would go to Fidencios and everything was fine. You know, so we learned a lot about transgender fluidity. We had no problems. The other thing that I was a listener, and I would listen to my aunts, my mother, my grandmother, framing the women in our history, you know, and I don't know whether this was unusual in most households, but since my grandmother had gone through the revolution as a supporter, and since, you know, they were part of this long resistance movement and protection of land rights for indigenous communities, they very often referenced the fact that despite the long battles for gender rights in Mexico, women and their battles and they're fighting alongside the men, they still didn't have the right to vote. And that's how these comments that I learned, these lessons that I learned came to be, you know, because they would start by saying, well, look at Doña Josefa Ortiz de Dominguez, the big heroine of the Mexican independence movement. We'd go back to the independence movement. You know, we look at her and how her husband, who was a Spanish governor, imprisoned her and wouldn't let her, you know, participate in the conspiracies against the Spanish government, you know, and then how, you know, she was amazing, but history books never talk about this, that she refused to get out of prison until, you know, the Mexicans were really free, you know, and not just ruled by people like Santana, you know, who came to power and deposed the first independentista movement. And they were talking about, well, look about Leona Vicario, when she sold her jewels to make cannon for the war. And then the men said, oh yes, well, she just wanted to do that because she wanted to join her boyfriend in battle. And so they never, you know, they always said, well, the women just wanted to do this because they wanted to be around the men, you know, and not because the women were patriots and they wanted to fight. And then the other thing that they really got on about, they really got hot and bothered about, was Doña Marina, la Malinche, called la Malinche, the traitor to the people, the slave that had a child with Cortés. And of course, my grandmother would always start with, you know, since when does a slave have the right to say, oh, please don't rape me? And she would say that like that, oh, please don't rape me. You know, you don't have a choice. You get raped. And then the men in history from then on, they call you la chingada. How many are you familiar with chingar, the word? They call you a chingada. And then the philosophers come around, you know, the vendido philosophers in Mexico come around and say, well, we're all hijos de la chingada. Where does that put us? You know? And so she would say, well, if they want to be hijos de la chingada, I don't. You know, I honor her. You know, she did what a woman has to do. You know, she was, you know, a slave. And in battle, what else could she do? You know, and she represented our people well. She did the best that she could. And I will not accept that that she was a you know, como se dice, traicionera. You know, and then my grandmother would say, well, and I wrote about that in my book, so I plagiarized her words. But my grandmother would then say, well, look at all the other royalty, the people that were in power. What did? They did worse. They sold their daughters. They married their daughters off to the Spaniards, but they're okay. They're fine. They're heroes. This poor woman, she's the one that represents all the Mexican women. Well, when I grew up and I was in the Chicano movement, And we were getting this thing back at us. Not only myself, but Emily has a book full of illustrations. We all wrote about these women and we liberated these women. You know, we wrote about them, we changed their identities around, and we said, La Llorona is an advocate. She's not a monster that killed her children. She wails because she's lost a whole nation. And Doña Marina was an ambassador, a negotiator who negotiated very well for the native communities to keep them alive and safe, you know, and to maintain their land, you know. And Jose Ortiz de Dominguez was a hero. Leona Vicario, a heroine. You know, these women did what they needed to do for the nation. And so we learned these lessons as children. And then in the Chicano movement, we liberated these women, including the Virgin. In fact, I have an article that says when La Virgen de Guadalupe was a virgin. You know, we researched and proved that Our Lady of Guadalupe is Guadalupe, well, is Guadalupe Tonatzin. You know, she's a combination. She is a combination of the goddess creator Tonatzin and the Virgin Guadalupe. And so she rules. She rules in Mexico and in Central America, throughout the Americas, in fact. And so we rescued the goddess traditions from our indigenous roots. I'll just tell you one little example of how an aha moment. And these aha moments are moments in which you realize that our community in the Chicano movement was going in the wrong direction, and you bring it back, and then, like Fran, you do something about it, you know. And I'll just share one aha moment because time is fleeing here. When in the Chicano movement my husband, my daughter, baby, and I were very, very active have been, there's no end to the movement all our lives. But in that moment in 1969, I think I was delegated to be on stage and to present to the conference, to a Raza Unida conference, that we were on the wrong path. We were not addressing the issues that architects had with the housing, the issues that women had with choice, the issues that we had with childcare, the issues that policy issues that had to be addressed, that these guys considered women's issues and not just ego issues of who was going to lead the movement and what man was going to lead the movement. And so I got on stage and I was going to present the caucus resolution, which was a male, female caucus, you know, and one young man with our elders present, who had been in the movements from 30s, 40s, and 50s, present, you know, said, you know what, get off that stage and go home and do the dishes and take care of your children where you belong. For my children, my husband and child were there. And then I realized, boy, was I angry, como agua para chocolate. So then I realized, and a lot of us realized at that moment, that these men in the Chicano movement thought that Chicano liberation was literally Chicano liberation, you know, and not liberation for everybody, you know, and that they interpreted they said, well, go home and do the dishes to them was a cultural issue, that they considered logistics, you know, like who does the dishes, who does the laundry, to be culture. They were mistaking logistics for culture. And so then we had to, I realized there is nothing else to do but to write, to organize the women, to write, to train, to educate, to raise the consciousness of everybody, men and women, you know, because cultural values to us were everything that is valuable, like education, care, that is culturally, was protecting our land, protecting Mother Earth. You know, cultural values were spirituality that was not based on for everybody. And that's where it all started. I mean, from then on, of course, women had been writing forever and ever and ever, but Chicano feminists, in the second wave feminists, you know, for all of us, the departure point was at that point where sexism, you know, raised its head, and where we realized that we're not going to get anywhere, and to, you know, frame that sex to eradicate those barriers that were keeping the women in the parliament. And a lot of people talk about, well, what else did you do? Well, look at my resume. But believe me, we did more than just write. When we wrote, and tomorrow, actually, you'll have an example of that. You know, when we wrote, we also did a lot more than just write. Most of us, you know, build institutions. Most of us build Chicano Latino Studies Centers. I'm a proud founder of the one at UT and the department. Institutions that are multi-million-dollar institutions, worked on economic development issues. I established the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, founding member, Women's Chamber of Commerce in Austin. Everything, a lot of it not very sexy, but everything that we could do to reach civil rights, voting rights, and economic justice, especially regarding the taxes that we pay into the system. I mean, to me, that's what it's all about. But thank you very much. Wish we could hear a lot more. The one on the Chicana and African American and other, you know, feminists have done to advance this nation.
Why is Naxil? Hello, my relatives. Iskuis Tsipat. My name is Tsipat. That's my Indian name that my maternal grandfather gave me when I was a baby. And if you don't tell anybody, I'll tell you what it means. It means water spring. In Chakan Sinaichkst, I am from my maternal lineage from Southeast British Columbia up where the Arrow Lakes are. If you can see on a map, that's my territory, most of it. The rest, after the border was established, down in this Washington. And anyway, that's my background. I'm glad to know that tomorrow during the conference, there will be a panelist telling more about my case, Donna Coker, because she wrote a chapter on my case in a book called Criminal Law Stories. And she did a wonderful job. She came up in my reservation and the Colville Reservation and stayed a couple days. And so I don't have to go into it. But if you can't make it, you can Google, learn how to Google. Search Yvonne Wanrow, W-A-N-R-O-W. That was my married name at the time this case happened. At the time I was divorced. I didn't know at the time that I could change my name, or I didn't even know that when I got married, I had to change my name from Swan to Wanrow. But it seemed the thing to do because it seemed like everybody else was doing it at the time. I saw some pictures of my children made me happy. But I never knew anything, a difference, you know, about how women were treated, because my family, we had a close-knit family. My father and mother treated all of us equally. My father, there was 5 of us girls and 2 older boys. And we all were happy, you know, we lived on the reservation. My brothers taught me how to hunt and fish. I helped Dad, I mom in the garden. There's a lot of respect in the community. I want to start out my maternal tupa, my great grandma, Rosalie Seymour. She was the boss. In our language, tiklamilch is woman, and ilmichum translates sort of to boss. So my grandma, my great grandma, my tupa, she was a boss woman. And all the adult men and the whole family, she had about 6 kids, and all the generations, they all respected her. She lived to be 120 years old. And my mother told me she was 120, but they say she was 108, but she was 120. My mother didn't lie. My mother was my teacher. My mother was my mentor, my doctor, my nurse. She was everything. So from that lineage, my mother was smart enough to tell me that when I was little, gave me something to be proud of. And my auntie told me that I looked like her. So I'm going to be around for a while, maybe. Anyway, my mother was politically active in the 60s, and she wanted to defend our land because the government wanted to terminate federal supervision over all Indians so that they could take over the land and resources. So they sent me and other children away from the reservation into cities to learn careers so that we would get out of the way. And they put some in prison who were active and the people listening to them. She told the elders, and she translated for the elders to the and there was pros and cons. The leadership, some of them wanted a big payoff to terminate us. We would have been just totally without land or status as Indian people. So we won. I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about the case, because looking back, sitting there thinking about it, when I was convicted on May 13th, 1973, which was Mother's Day, for protecting myself and 8 children in that home, and 3 women, 1 man. Before that, I believed in justice. I thought, sure, the jury's going to understand the fear that I had of this man, because I thought anyone who would molest a child is dangerous, able to do anything. I've seen violence in my life, people, and I knew the violence, potential violence. And so when I was convicted by 7 women and 5 men, I couldn't believe it at first. And then I realized that I was going to go to prison, and they were going to take my kids away from me, the very kids that I defended, that I loved and I cherished. Creator gave me those kids. So I told my sisters, you have to help me. We got to do something, because I got to take part in my own defense. And so all of the sisters, my 4 sisters, helped me. We used our talents to set up fashion shows. And the motive was to raise consciousness about our culture, because there was so much racism, so much hate towards our people for years, that we needed to show the people that we were human beings with honor, love. And so in the meantime, my sister, people to know about my case. So I realized, okay, I'm going to have to speak, but I'm too nervous. But she made me read those commentary cards as my nieces danced out to Indian music down the runway to show our designs and our clothes. And I got over my shyness of speaking before people. I was trying to speak, but people wanted to buy the money to manufacture anything. You know, we did the best we can. We traveled, and through that, I met Buffy St. Marie, who is a Cree nation, from the Cree nation. She's a singer, songwriter, and she heard about my story when I was speaking. The American Indian movement allowed me a few minutes to speak in Missoula, Montana, at the university, and Buffy heard me, and she wrote out a check and told me to go to Los Angeles and talk to her publicist. And her publicist wrote a 5-page story and fed it to the feminist press in Hollywood. She used all her contacts. The women sent it across the country, into Europe, all of them. At the time of my trial, before my trial, I met this man who was a Dakota Sioux from Siston, South Dakota. His name was Floyd Red Curl Westerman. And that's our daughter in the picture. When we first met, and he asked me, well, what do you do? Do you go to school or whatever, you know? And I told him, try to what for. And so I told him I shot a man, a child molester, murder and first-degree assault, because there was a shot. I don't remember shooting the other guy, but that's the assault. Right away, he saw the comparison across the country, how Indian people were discriminated against in the courts. And at that time, the American Indian movement had bad publicity. We were called militants and all the derogatory names you could think of. And I was just one of the victims. And he saw that right away. So that prosecutor, easy case, a woman, Indian woman. He didn't say anything about me being a woman, but in trial, and I have to tell you this, he looked right at me and he said, we brought the guns here first. You have no right to take the law into your own hands. You know, and I sat through that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday trial, 4 days, 4.5 days, shortest day probably. Shortest trial. You know, and I witnessed a lot of things. Me. And I became proud of who I was. And at first, my sister, who made this dress, she could make clothes. She dressed me, you know, conservatively. And my lawyer told me, don't show your Indianness and don't disturb me when I'm defending you. So I thought, objective, I didn't even know what the word objective meant. So I sat there. The prosecutor, look at her. Calmly, she sits there. Tape issue, read it. Read up on it. I was discriminated against by my voice. I was hysterical, but so hysterical I almost lost my voice. When I asked for help on the telephone, when my babysitter called the police to send somebody after the shooting, by comparison to my voice, she was a Siyapi, she was a white woman, and her voice, a man broke in and my girlfriend shot him, send somebody right away, and she was just yelling like that. So he was very dramatic in court and very conniving. He showed the jury, the unsuspecting jury, of all the stereotypical notions and the racism about a hysterical woman. Okay, that's it. But we won on the base of that tape twice on appeal. She mentioned that I had William Kunstler, the well-known civil rights attorney. I love that man, and I wanted him to be my lawyer at the trial by another lawyer. I was able to meet him. Trial, you know, very short, brief. He said, I read your papers. I'll take your. See some women's issues in here. I'd like to take it to the women lawyers in the center. He co-founded the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York City. I didn't know anything about women's issues. This man, I mean, I adored him. He was smart. Okay, all right. I wanted him, but you know, I wasn't going to say no to this man. So the next day he called and he said, the women want to take a case. So then I had to go back and forth to New York City. And that's a whole book in itself, that experience. So that was 76 February, when my two women lawyers from the Center of Constitutional Rights spoke up for me before 12 justices in the capital of Washington. Besides, they brought up the instruction, sexist jury. When you read it, it looks like they're talking about these white men that sound like talking about a man who was on trial. And so my lawyers argued both those cases, Nancy Stearns and Elizabeth Schneider. And I waited. In the meantime, the women's organizations across the country, and I was getting invited here and there. And the people in Berkeley called me and they said, there's an international tribunal on crimes against women in Brussels, Belgium in March of '76. And they said, we'd like you to your way. And some churches, the Methodist Church, and I don't know what other church, donated to fund my trip to Brussels. And I was sure, yes, yes. I wasn't going to say no. I was on the trail to defend my life for my kids. In a word, I was stubborn. I wanted to be with my kids and nobody was going to interfere in that. I made a commitment. My dad, he'd shake his head at me. That Yvonne should do anything. I mean, I had no fear when I was younger, you know? So anyway, I was so afraid. I have to go overseas. I have to go. I have never been over there. I can't. So I asked the women, feminists, can I take my boyfriend? And they just, they looked at each other. They couldn't believe what they heard. And then I realized that it sounded really stupid because I'm going to a women's conference. So anyway, that made me think. Plus, my lawyers, when they talked to me, they were Nancy Stearns and Elizabeth Schneider and there's a couple lawyers in Washington State. They made sure I understood everything before I made a decision. And they taught me how to be a feminist, women power. I was proud of being St. Eichst. I was proud of being, my dad was a Chippewa Cree and a Assiniboine Sioux. I was proud of that. But when I learned from my lawyers and the committee members, the defense committee members, the pride in being a woman, I was doubly empowered. Plus, the case changed the law in a positive way for all women across the country regarding the law of self-defense. And if it helped one person, all my worry in the 12 years would have been okay, good. case changed me in a positive way because I was just a young girl. I didn't have any plans, you know, I was wandering. I lost a child and I was mourning. So, you know, I got into all trying to survive, trying to decide what to do with my life, maybe pursue my art work, my talents or something, you know, when this happened. I was 28 years old. I learned through my proactivity, my actions and everything through life as I met people, I met women, I met Black people, I met Chicanas, I met Mexicans, Hawaiians, Maoris, Germans, Swiss, Irish. I met all of them as I traveled because like I said, I kept getting invited around. I thought Spokane is racist and I have to get out there and blah, 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 you know, talk to people, get support, shine the light on Spokane, roust out the good people so that I can stay here with my kids. So you, each one of you, are a sovereign individual. You can do what you want. Make up your mind, use your heart. Get in sync with your mind and do it. Men or women, you know? I taught my son to respect women since he was a little boy, and I remind him when he was growing up. And I teach my girls, you know, how to be respectful for themselves. So it's just education. That was my teacher like that, so she taught me. I had a lot of anger because of racism, but she told me, Yvonne, if you're going to get angry, if you want to get angry at something, don't get angry at the person. Get angry at what the person did. That way, nobody gets hurt. So she taught me a lot. She taught me to feel like a landlady. She said, all that land is yours. Of course, they say different, but it's yours. So she, great grandma, her mom, my family. So I connected all of that. Sure, we're colonized. I'm standing here speaking English. I've been colonized. I was forced to learn English. So I'm struggling with that, you know, to decolonize my thinking and help decolonize my other survival. It's survival for all of us. The work that these women are doing, that they're teaching me. Thank you, thank you. Thank you. I'm happy because you are asserting your leadership, your knowledge, your intellect for the best betterment of me and you and the whole world. I get emotional because I've seen so much violence and so much death. So many of our women are being sent to prison. There's women in Washington State. 2 from my tribe were murdered. Their remains were found. You know, and there's missing and there's bodies being found of women. Nobody's going to help me. Nobody's going to help us on the reservation, but ourselves. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, I saw a bumper sticker last in the 70s says BIA stands for Boss Indians Around. Well, they're not going to help me. Sometimes some of the council, they get greedy. They're not going to help me. Is the United States going to help me? I don't know. I don't think so. I'm not going to count on it. I was convicted on Mother's Day, remember? So it's up to us. So what I do is I teach. I'm the matriarch, the eldest of my family now. Me and my younger sister were the only ones left. Culturally, traditionally, we take care of my siblings, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. So I'm a busy person now. Can't travel a lot like I used to. Home is where I have to work now. But my family, they understand. My kids, they know that mom is safe. I'm in good hands wherever I go. So in 1976 was the Constitution, right? 1776, sorry, thank you. I looked at you because I knew you had the answer. Okay, 1776. Okay, I have to say this, and I don't know about my time, but I have to say this. When George Washington became president, all right, he wanted to write the Bill of Rights, set up the government. I call it a business, but it's called a government. So he heard about the Indian people on the East Coast, the Six Nations. And he said, he told his people that he liked their model of democracy because it was working. Well, of course it was, because the women were in power. They were leaders. They picked the leaders. They sent the bad ones moving out if they didn't conduct themselves in the right way. They took care of the land, everything. The matriarchs, the women, the bosses, and the spirituality. We don't have religion. We have a way of life. So Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson brought back all this information to George Washington, and all of them, I mean, do you know, you read the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, there's nothing about indigenous or any kind of spirituality. And the women are not, the women have given their lives trying to get some recognition that they, they want a part of this country to help people. So they didn't want to pay attention to the women. That's why we're here. I mean, we know we're right. Men here know we're right. Thank you, men, for coming. A lot of people, a lot of our women get beaten because we are smarter than them sometimes. But anyway, so I got emotional. I've had plenty of healings. I've been to ceremonies. The creator, Kulanchutin. In my language, Kulanchutin is you call God, creator, literally translated. Kulanchutin means one who created one's self. You can share that with whomever you want. So that's why I'm here. Because I spoke to Kulanchutin. As my leaders, my spiritual leaders, my mentors told me to tell Kulanchutin. Immediately they understood. The medicine men, they said, that wasn't your fault, that shooting. It was an accident. They said, how does a jury know? They weren't there. They opened my eyes. They honored me because they were some of them were from the Six Nations. Our allies, our relatives, So people, I'm just saying that because people ask, what made you, what helped you become strong? What helped you endure? Speaking of questions, if anybody has any questions, I welcome you to ask, because I'm kind of there's so much to tell and I don't want to take all the time. Okay. Why? Lim lim tel kul kun hit. Thank you.
Many of my colleagues here do, and we know that people often think that history is made by a man or by somebody who's an official, who's in government, who's been given the power to exert leadership. But historians know that leadership comes from all different kinds of places, and sometimes the bravest and most important and most consequential leadership comes from everyday people. And in this case, the women who are represented here tonight, and I'm using Ula as a stand-in for Fran. Fran Beal was the author of the statement of intersectionality, double jeopardy in 1969 of Black feminism. That was Frances Beal, a secretary and a mother. Martha Cotera was the author of the first Chicana Feminist statement. Two parts of that, but we'll just go with the second one, which is called the Chicana Feminist in 1977. That is Martha Cotera. That's the woman who's here tonight with Fran Beal. And Yvonne Wanrow fought for her very life and the lives of her children, and won a case with the help of white feminists from New York City. And they prevailed and created what was known as, and still is known as, the battered women's defense, so that thousands and thousands of women across the country could stand before a juror and say, I was short, I was small, I have been beaten many times, and I finally took a gun in my hand. And no one would say to that woman, well, that's not what a man would do. Because of course it's not what a man would do. Sometimes gender is relevant. And that's what Yvonne's case showed, that women and men are equal, and when it doesn't matter, gender should not be introduced. But there's sometimes when it does matter. And that was Ruth Bader Ginsburg's insight as well. She learned that from Polly Murray, an African-American woman who was denied admission to Harvard University because she was, one place it was because she was Black, and another place it's because she was a woman. Anyway, she finally got her degree, and it was she who, with Eleanor Roosevelt, it was Polly Murray who devised the defense that Ruth Bader Ginsburg later used. And so it's from such women as this, and the three here who are here tonight, who are responsible for why all of us are sitting in this audience as safely as we are. So I'd like to see if we have a few minutes for introductions. I don't want to forget that we also have provided and organized by our wonderful assistant, Margaret Gregory, the graduate student here, the raffle. All of you, we have a raffle, prizes. So we will do that right before the end, but we have time, about 10 minutes for questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please stand up. We also have a microphone, and I know all of our women would love to answer them.
That speech where I was told to, oh my gosh, no, because in the early day, during the movement, we did not record speeches. These conferences were very ad hoc. They were huge. This was in Houston, but they were very ad hoc, and we never even had, like, I probably have I may have the recommendations in my archives. By this, I mean what I actually read to the body. It's probably at the UT archives in the Benson collection. Now that I think about it, they probably have it there. So we had notes reading from my husband was in the caucus resolution, in the caucus committee meeting that developed the resolutions I was reading. So I was actually representing a mixed group of people. And even then, I guess, and it's because we had never before had any women on stage at any of our conference meetings. That's why. I think so. In Texas, in the movement conferences, yes. I do remember another time in Austin, and this is really the same thing. I remember another conference in '67 in Austin, Texas, where I did not have a place on stage, but I asked to speak. And it was because it was very sparsely attended, and it was mostly men that were coming to the conference. And so I remember saying from the mic, I remember saying distinctly, if you guys would invite your girlfriends and your wives, and I meant it that way, that everybody laughed, we would have twice as many people here. They're like, but I meant it, and they knew what I meant because they had both. And actually, following that, we actually did begin to have a lot more women in there, because then we saw we had to go out there and recruit more women, girlfriends and wives and others,
Prepared, being that I'm a professor, that's what we do with our lives and our free time. We hear a lot about intersectionality, and of course it's at intersections that we have car crashes usually, right? When you get to the intersection, that's when you hit up against somebody else. And you both talked a little bit about intersectionality in the sense of within the Chicana movement, within the Black movement, to be a Black woman amongst Black men and some of the conflicts. What about other aspects of intersectionality, working with white feminists? What were the problems there? What were the times when that was useful and helpful, as it had been to Yvonne, and other times that it was a challenge? I mean, this is the kind of thing we need to also document and know about.
Right. Well, we had worked with white women already, with radical white women. We were very comfortable with that in the anti-war movement, particularly, and all other movements. So we were not strangers to that. With the mainstream feminist movement, we felt it was late coming. That wave was late. It followed the Black Power movement. It followed the Chicana movement. So they came kind of later. Not by a lot, by a couple of years, at least. So we felt that we needed to be there to make sure that the movement addressed the issues of our community. And we also felt that it was not fair, it was always about fairness, that this group of women be expected to carry our agenda alone, but that we could help and bring our bodies, bring our experience to the movement. So we were wanting to strengthen the movement. We were not interlopers. In fact, we got in trouble with our community for being in the women's movement. Not because of the issues, but because they felt that the women's movement wasn't ready for us. Now, they felt that the women's movement might detract from the power base that we were trying to build up, that we would be too scattered, in other words, that and also the men actually thought, this is where a lot of education had to take place, that the women's movement was an Anglo movement, and had no place in our agenda. And we were trying to say, no, our agenda is the same as the women's movement agenda, because it was.
Then let us conclude with our raffle. And so we were talking about this with the graduate students. And by the way, I also really want to thank Catherine Clinton of UTSA, because I told you it had been 45 years since I had organized a conference, studiously ignoring these kinds of possible responsibilities. But when I met Yvonne and I met Martha, and of course I knew about Fran, I contacted my old friend, Catherine Clinton, who's always game for anything. And I said, how about if we do this conference, and I'll do a lot of the stuff, but would you support me and would you co-organize it with me? And she said yes. So I want to thank Catherine, who's renowned as a mentor in the historical profession. So thank you. All right. So since we have 3 prizes, and they are pretty awesome prizes you're about to see, And we have 3 guests. I'd like each of them to draw a name. If the first person you draw is not here, well, too bad for them. You have to draw another name. So let's see. Okay, Yvonne. Okay. Drum roll. Okay.
I've never had.
You got it. You got it.
Fortunate. Feminist conference raffle. This is from a fortune. Felipe,
Felipe Hinojosa.
Yes.
Our professor, Felipe Hinojosa,
One of our sponsors.
who's getting a t-shirt anyway, because I got one for him. So let's draw another one. Let's see. Felipe, you do not get 2. No double dipping.
What happened?
That's okay. He was a professor. I already got him. Okay, you got it. Oh,
Jana Ryan.
Jana Ryan. Jana Ryan did not come. Okay, well, that's too bad for Jana Ryan. All right. I hope you're not filming this part, Catherine, because this is a little embarrassing.
You're like, oh, this a lot. Terry
Pantuso.
Pantuso.
Terry Pantuso? Or we're just going to start asking you to name your name.